Hello. We have everyone joining us now. We'll give them a minute and we'll start the party. I think we can start. Hi, Frank. Hi, John Twitcher. Okay. So, welcome. I'm Lihi. I will be hosting you today with my dear colleagues, Chris and Ranger, and our very distinguished panel of experts. This is EarthX Live, May edition, and today we have panel members from the health sector, electrical sector, and communications. Use the chat. It's always a great pleasure to see what wonderful conversations and new connections people are making using that platform. We promise if you have a question, we have our team dedicated to read your questions and pass them to Ranger and Chris. So if you have things you want to ask, this would be the right place to do so. And of course, we will get back to you if there are bigger answers than just a line in the chat. Very important. We have a lot of resources that we give away. Just visit our website. We have monthly blogs that we post. We have a very rich library of videos. We have all our past events recorded, including our summits. And we also offer a membership program that gives you much more benefits than just visiting our website. So check it out. Also on our LinkedIn account, we always post more information. So use those free platforms to be a part of our community. Very important announcement. London is coming back. We had a very successful event last year, and we are going to repeat it this September. So save the date, 23 and 24th of September in Imperial College London, our great partners. There's going to be a very interesting panel of speakers and guests. So sales started. So go to our website and get your spot. I talked about our website. You can see all the interesting projects that the council is working on. But I think the most, and you will hear today about our BSX platform and about Genome platform. A new ePro handbook is coming out, Black Start. Chris could tell you more about that. And the Human Continuity Project. We are now launching our Human Continuity Project. We have a lot of new members, and we would love you to join us. So check our website for more information. And of course, why we are here for the EarthX training, which has been very successful the past 6 years. So thank you for joining us. We will start with introduction, then Ranger will present the scenarios, and then we're going to have a panel discussion. The idea would be each panel would be presenting his approach to what happened to the scenario, and then we will have a joint conversation with everyone about it. And I would like to start with Avi, our president. Avi, it would be great if you could give us a few words. CEO, now we have a new president, Paul, that is joining us as well. Avi, the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you, Lihi. And thanks so much, both to all of the participants in the exercise and to everyone who is joining us today. So interesting, we tend to just talk about this as another exercise, but I think this is really not just another exercise, because what these EarthX Live exercises take a look at is black sky events. And to provide a little context, usually what powers exercises is people talk about typical events, typical disasters, how can we learn with 2020 hindsight? What did we do wrong? What worked? What didn't work in different disasters? When you look at black sky events, fundamentally events which have the potential to shut down or extremely severely disrupt our tightly interconnected global all sector civilization. You can't learn from the past. 2020 hindsight doesn't work. So the one opportunity you have is to learn from the future, something that Paul Williams refers to as a pre-mortem, as opposed to a post-mortem. And to help that process along a little bit, let me tell you a bit of a story, something that we're all very familiar with. Think about the 1930s back in the last century. There was a nation in Europe that had become, for a variety of reasons, very aggressive, was in the process of wars of aggression. And the end result of that was devastating on a scale that we're all familiar with, but fortunately none of us intimately familiar with, but devastating. Entire communities destroyed, disappeared. I'm speaking to you from Jerusalem, Israel. 1/3 of the Jews alive at 1940 were no longer alive in 1945. You know, in the 30s, life felt normal for most people. You could go to a restaurant, go to a coffee shop, everything seemed just fine. You could have a nice glass of wine in Paris. A few years later, Paris was an occupied city in an occupied country. Things can change very quickly. And what we're seeing now, does anything about this sound familiar? Is there a nation in Europe that is involved in wars of aggression? We have a variety of enemies out there, and there is a very serious difference from what happened in the last World War. None of the adversaries of the United States or its partners or allies had weapons of mass destruction. That situation is a game changer. And what it means is even from World War II, there is a very limited amount that we can learn. The only hope really we have is to learn from the future. And that's the opportunity that we have today in this exercise. So it's not just another exercise. And the real hope is that everyone involved, certainly not just the participants in the direct exercise, but everyone involved, everyone listening in. If you take this seriously and recognize, you know what, something really extreme could happen, and the only chance we have to prepare for it is now, then I think there is every reason to be hopeful, because from the research that we've done, it's not that difficult, it's not that expensive to take the basic steps needed to make it possible to recover. Now, no question, in an extreme event, there will be a lot of suffering. But the difference between a lot of suffering and civilization recovering, life going on, and not, is just impossible to express. So I won't even try. Anyway, I very much hope that everyone involved today will take this opportunity very, very seriously and take it to heart. Think about what you can do, how you can get involved in helping to prepare for disasters on this kind of scale. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Avi. This is Chris Beck. I'm the Chief Scientist and Vice President for Policy here at EIS Council. And I think Avi set the table for why are we here today. What we're talking about is Avi took us back to 1930. We can see the difference in population of the world quadrupled in the last 100 years. And that has been possible because we rely on our critical infrastructures to support life and our economies and our societies. And as Avi said, sometimes things happen that we're not anticipating. And one of them is a black sky event, which means a blackout of the electric power, which is kind of, as far as infrastructures go, the first among equals. Most everything relies on electricity. And so we are here to do a pre-mortem, as Avi noted, and what we often call lessons imagined, because we'd rather experience this kind of thing in an exercise and be ready for it when it happens in the real world. Next slide, please. So what could cause a black sky event? Well, there's a handful of things, some malicious and some natural. And we're seeing all of these things. We had an extreme solar storm just this past weekend. I'll get to that in a second. We've seen earthquakes around the world, and depending on where they strike, they could definitely impact critical infrastructure. Climate change is something we're dealing with. We're just coming out of COVID. As I mentioned, I'm really happy to see that we were able to weather this last fairly intense solar storm. And that, I think, is we're still waiting, since it was only this past weekend, to see some of the studies and after action, after event reports. But in the first iteration, I would think that some of the work that the North American Electric Reliability Corporation and FERC have done to help the grid be ready for the in extra currents that would flow through it during a CME appears to have helped. Next slide, please. We're going to hear from experts today. Another sort of climate-related issue. California has had to cycle power on and off of public safety power shutoffs due to wildfires, and these stress the grid. And so folks are dealing with rolling brownouts, rolling blackouts now on a regular basis. The question is whether we can control them as needed, or if they cascade out of control. That's when we get to a black sky event. Next slide. Floods. We've seen if floods in places that we don't normally see. There's as weather and climate events intensify, we have to realize that just because it hasn't happened in the past, we do live in a different climate. We're just getting used to that. And so relying on historical, it never rains here, it never gets that cold in Texas, et cetera, we can't rely on past weather patterns. Next slide, please. Cyber attacks are happening right now, 100%. The grid, other infrastructures, financial sector, et cetera, are kind of under constant cyber attack. And we've had some that then impacted things like Colonial Pipeline and others. So this is something that we're going to see today, and we know that can happen. Russia relentlessly attacking the infrastructure of Ukraine, and you know, these are events that we're dealing with, and so we're very excited to have some experts here to help us think through this. We're putting them on the playing field, and all of us can benefit. As he said, please add your thoughts to the chat. This as I said earlier, we try to bring these exercises to look at the electric sector and other critical infrastructures and their interconnections and connected impacts. So today we're lucky to be joined by electric sector folks, health sector folks, and emergency communications. So for electrical, we have Thomas Jacobus here from Southern California Edison, like I said, on the front line of these kinds of challenges. Rick Morose is an expert that the council leans on a lot. You've seen him here before, because Rick has a breadth of experience, not just in the electric sector, of which he was a state regulator and the former CEO and president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and now provides consulting work on electric sector and other critical infrastructure resilience. So thank you both for being here. We're glad to be joined by Scott Blevins. I believe James Meese had a last minute schedule challenge, so we will hope to have James back in a future discussion. But thankfully, our in-house expert is someone who Scott Blevins has the really direct experience of this, his work with the council on our energy sector web, but brings to the council his 25 years of being a communications officer in the Kentucky National Guard. Thank you, Scott, for being here. And finally, health sector folks, two folks that focus on the cyber challenge, which we'll be seeing today, Matt Christensen from Intermountain Health and Lisa Bisterfeld from St. Luke's Health System. Thank you both for being here. And our dear friend, Eric Cote, who has been on the forefront of trying to get hospital systems and other healthcare delivery infrastructures to be prepared for a Black Sky event by focusing most of his efforts on what emergency backup power needs to be brought to bear to add to that resilience. So thank you to our health panel, Matt, Lisa, and Eric. At this point, I'd like to hand the baton to our master exercise practitioner, Ranger Dorn, who will take us through the exercise. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Ranger Dorn, I'm the exercise program director for the council. I do see a raised hand. If you have a question, can you please put it into chat and we'll be happy to answer it there. We're not going to be stopping for questions as we go, but we will take them in chat and someone will answer you. All right, we have done this a couple of times before. We started last September. We threw out what at the time was still kind of seeming like a little more of a remote possibility. It was something that we knew that the war in Ukraine was ongoing. There were threats from different powers to use weapons of mass destruction. And it still seemed a little more tenuous at that point. Then we came to last January. We saw much more of a active worldwide involvement with different conflicts. We had Israel added in, and we see once again other countries threatening to use these weapons of mass destruction. We have multiple world leaders out there doing it now, and currently the EMP programs of a number of nations are being talked about as thoughts for space weapons. Russia in particular noting that, and each of these brings this what used to be kind of a remote possibility to something at the forefront. At the same time, 5-6 years ago, we knew that there were a number of hacks out there, but it wasn't a big deal. Now we're seeing some of the biggest organizations, most important organizations, government organizations that should have the highest protections, having significant cyber attacks, successful cyber attacks. United Healthcare, Dropbox, Dell. We could change the logos almost daily with the number of things that have happened here. This all brings us to this point where our scenarios 5-6 years ago would have been at the outside edge. Now they're at the center of the news. So with that kind of sets the stage for what we're going to talk about here. Leahy is going to go ahead and start our video. We're going to play you a scenario. When the scenario is done, we're going to go panel by panel. We're going to talk through it, and these are taken from the news. Go ahead, Leahy. Thank you.
East of Florida. No indication as to who launched them. No one has claimed responsibility at this point. We are waiting for more information and government confirmation, and we will provide updates when we get them. NWS breaking news. Power and communications have shut down the island of Bermuda, apparently due to this morning's nuclear explosion over the Atlantic.
Lights are off here in Bermuda. The power outage has knocked out communications across the island. Tourists have begun to look for ways to get home. But with the Bermuda airport closed, many people stuck here with no idea what the future holds.
Still in shock from yesterday's disturbing events, this morning, people across the United States and around the globe found this on their computer screens. Besides this ransomware attack, a number of targeted cyber attacks, including attacks on major global landmarks. Last night, the lights on the Statue of Liberty blinked on and off. In Times Square, outdoor screens showed flashing skull and crossbones images. Also, lights went out on Big Ben in London and on the Eiffel Tower.
We have been asked to activate the VSX emergency communication system by a number of emergency authorities based on concerns of international instability. Starting last night, a wave of ransomware attacks have been hitting organizations with weaker cybersecurity. A number of locations that includes critical lifeline utilities. Now, while directed attacks have been mostly limited to national icons, the nature of these attacks is worrisome. The technology used was able to bypass some very secure systems.
All right, thank you, Leahy. What we're going to do now is we're going to reach out to the panels one at a time. And really what I want to ask, I'm going to start with the health and medical panel, is what are your immediate concerns for your sector at this point?
Well, Ranger, this is Eric Cody speaking. My immediate concern would be the emergency power assets of the affected areas. So I'm agnostic in terms of what threats cause a reliance on emergency power, whether it's a natural disaster or, as Chris mentioned, in California, public safety power shutoffs. Regardless of the cause, the power is out and the emergency power system becomes the lifeline for that hospital. But we're talking here about a black sky event, and that is a very different situation because that implies a very long-term outage, possibly weeks. And that's something that's never occurred in this country. And based on my work recently with the Los Angeles County Emergency Medical Services Agency, I've learned a lot about the state of hospital emergency power systems. And what I've learned is that some of them are very robust and resilient, and others are not. And what I see happening in a long-term outage scenario is the cascading failure of hospital emergency power systems and a shortage of resources to replace those, such as generators and fuel. So I think jurisdictions would be looking at a scenario of having to ration generators and fuel and decide which hospitals need to be kept open and which hospitals should be closed to conserve those resources. And just making those decisions, those are enormously challenging decisions to make. And if the community hasn't taken the first steps of assessing what emergency power looks like at their hospitals, who has the best systems, who has the weakest systems, they'll be at a real disadvantage in terms of having to make those quick decisions about which facilities to close and which to sustain with fuel and generators as needed.
Okay, thank you, Eric. Lisa, how about from your organization's perspective, your sector?
Yeah, my St. Luke's Health System is based out of Idaho. And so I think my biggest concern is, while Eric speaks about the importance of generator power, I think also looking at those rural areas where unfortunately we might not have the luxury of closing down an entire facility, just given the access to care and the immediate need of those critical hospital locations. Additionally, I'm thinking about, we all know that hospitals have the desire to have 96 hours of fuel on site, but I think also better understanding what is the capability of when you're only operating with that generator. One of the things in healthcare that we've identified is just the importance of leveraging technology to do our day-to-day work all the time. When we get into some of those smaller facilities or those rural areas or hospitals that might not have a huge budget for infrastructure, their generators might not be that large. And so being able to understand what does that continuity look like, knowing that you're only operating under generator power. Additionally, I'm thinking of our remote workforce. A lot of what we do day to day to ensure that we keep things operational is leveraging remote workforce. And so that could be greatly impacted if we don't have our traditional power mechanisms. So a few things going through my mind there. Obviously, just what is the capability, knowing that we might be on generator for an extreme amount of time, and ensuring that we, have the Wi-Fi connections, all of those pieces, and really thinking about those rural areas where divert or temporary shutdown just might not be an option.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And Matt, let me ask you the same question. And I heard a touch on the Internet of Things, the reliance on Wi-Fi and so on. Can you talk about the cyber aspect, or the I'll call it the non-power infrastructure issues related to health and medical?
You bet. Thanks, Ranger. While we haven't had a physical dark sky event, I would argue that many health systems, and especially more recently, have had a logical dark sky event. And by that, they have had entire systems down, for days, weeks, and some even months. And maybe it's not entire systems, but a segment of critical systems absolutely have been down. And so I think the one thing I would emphasize on is, are we drilling to yesterday's threats, or are we drilling and creating muscle confusion in our exercises to tomorrow's threats? And I think it's more of the latter than the former.
All right, thank you. Chris, I see your hand up.
Thank you. I just wanted to stress a point that Lisa brought up, which is the fact that she has the experience of being at understanding rural hospitals where there is the cognizance of evacuating this hospital is a real challenge, because we have to go a long ways to get to maybe the next facility, and the understanding that they need to keep the facility to be resilient, because evacuation is challenging. If we have a black sky event, everyone is going to have to think like Lisa thinks, because if you're in a city and you think, well, we'll evacuate our hospital folks to the one down the street, but if the whole city's blocked out or the whole state is blacked out, everyone has to have that internal resilience mentality. So I wanted to stress that in normal emergencies, the response and planning may not hold up if the disaster is long enough term and has a big enough footprint. So we need to be cognizant of that. So thank you for that point, Lisa.
All right, and Eric, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to also amplify Lisa's point and Chris's point as well. So I mentioned Los Angeles as an example, but in Lisa's case, where she has a rural community that she's serving, that rural hospital probably should be near the top of the prioritization list in terms of sustaining its emergency power. And there's plenty of planning steps you can take to be ready for that. Understanding what size generators that facility uses, how large is their fuel tank. All of that information would help emergency management officials arrange to have generators of like size standing by in case that generator or those generators at a rural facility were to fail. So great points, and just more examples of what considerations need to be part of that planning process.
Okay, I'd like to ask a question related to this. We're talking about the power for the hospitals. What about those other pieces of infrastructure that also rely on power? Can a hospital do without communications? Can a hospital do without, let's say, water, sewer, etc.? Are there other infrastructure elements that you rely enough on that could also cause that need to shut down? And I'll throw that out to I'll start with Lisa, and then Matt, and then back to Eric.
Yeah, I think you bring up a fantastic point, Ranger, and kind of what I was hitting at before is just our reliance on day-to-day operations. I think when we really, I guess, and also going back to Matt's comment, I think and back to Avi's introduction as well, is we have to be looking forward. I think we're looking a lot behind at what the disasters and the threats are that we historically were looking at. And therefore, we have the standard of 72 hours or 96 hours. In reality, that's a drop in the bucket, and we're going to be drowning very quickly in our inability to have infrastructure and typical technology and water that we need day to day. I think that we have had disasters that have shown this in the past. I think looking at COVID, for example, 96 hours of N95 masks got us less than a week, and we were really struggling as an industry to come around that. I think we talk about basic electricity, and I would love Matt to maybe chime in and kind of I guess, get your perspective on this, but from a cybersecurity perspective, knowing that there's instability and that we're seeing cybersecurity attacks on critical infrastructure, one of the biggest threats we would have is our ability to utilize our tools to ensure that our environment is safe from cyber criminals is reliant on the ability for that power grid. Our ability to communicate with our vendors, our ability to look at our endpoint detection and see anything malicious potentially coming through. And if we only have 96 hours of generator power, that puts us at a huge risk for becoming that next target. I also imagine that those cyber criminals are aware that a lot of hospitals only have 96 hours of fuel on site, which almost makes us a really vulnerable target in that situation. Matt, I don't know what your thoughts are. That's where my mind's going from a cybersecurity perspective. But Matt, what are your thoughts on kind of leveraging those different tool sets we have?
We need more people to think like you, Lisa. I think that's the theme so far in this webinar. Look, COVID-19 was the unfortunate descendant of 9/11, and I don't use that lightly. And so what's the next descendant of COVID-19? You're absolutely right. Bad actors they thrive at nighttime. They don't work 8 to 5. When crisis hits, that's when they go all in. If you look at attacks, they will spike at holidays that are observed in the United States or in other countries as well. They take advantage of it because they know the defenses that are normally up are down. And even when you're down for a period of time, just because the power gets picked back up doesn't mean everything else just restores to its natural state. And so they know that those first few days after we flip the switches back on, we're operating at a percentage that we would otherwise. So the one thing I would just say across all sectors, every critical infrastructure has the opportunity to do basic hygiene for their area. All of them have technology, all of them have servers, they have databases, they have humans, and there's some great guidance that CISA's put out just recently that really hits home on what are the basic safeguards anyone in critical infrastructure should be following. And if you follow those, it doesn't mean you won't get hacked, you won't have ransomware, you won't have these incidents that happen, but it does protect against many of the threats that we see today. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat in case anyone's interested for that resource.
Thank you, Matt. And before we continue on with this, I really want to ask a question overall for the healthcare and medical sector. How much is there a reliance now on cloud storage and remote records handling and access to it if we have a number of these things happen? How much of a problem is that? Matt or Lisa, if you want to talk to that. And then
I'll be very short. I actually view that more as an opportunity than I do a threat. When you can have data in co-locations on-prem, so if a cloud provider goes out, you can keep operating. If you can have a cloud provider that's in a completely different region than you, then I view that as more of an opportunity.
I would echo Matt's statements completely. I think, especially talking to this sector where redundancy is so important and so critical, that's a key aspect of having redundancy. Ranger, I think speaking to your thought is if we're experiencing an outage where we're only operating on generator, the potential of accessing that data might not be as easy as it has in the past. But one of the nice things that we would have from a healthcare perspective is we wouldn't lose that data. And I think that's what's most important to us. So we might need to go to downtime procedures, and we might need to adjust the way that we do work and our ability to access that moment in time. But the value is once we're able to recover, we haven't lost any of that patient data, and we're able to resume our operations more quickly. And so completely agree with Matt. It's a fantastic redundancy and one that is an amazing opportunity, and one that we really should be looking towards as we continue to mature in this space.
All right, thank you. I think that's a real key there is that redundancy. If data is lost at multiple locations, I could see where that would be a definite concern. Eric, do you have anything to add on the infrastructure questions, the wider infrastructure outside of generation?
Sure, absolutely. So we've seen in past disasters that loss of access to water has forced hospital closures and evacuations, even when electricity was available through emergency generators. So Ranger makes an excellent point. Critical utilities include electricity, water, wastewater treatment. So it's not always going to be the lack of electricity that's going to close a facility. It could very well be the lack of water.
All right. I heard mention of fuels, and all of us have a desire to refuel and a plan to refuel. The question does come in, is there enough to go around after a large-scale power outage? And do our infrastructure partners actually have a plan? If they're in need of the same fuel, where does it go first? Does it go to the hospital first? Does it go to the sewer plant, the water facility? Real good question. All of these, we're finding just how interrelated all of these different sectors are and how much they mean to us. What I'd like to do now is move on to the communications and the implications of what we're seeing here. Scott.
Yeah, so a couple of things to discuss on that. I mean, when you presented the scenario, you know, the communications sector, and of course, you know, I'm looking at the big picture. I'm looking at the national telecommunications networks, not per se within inside an organization. Obviously, there's a threat with ENP disrupting those. Obviously, if those small microelectronic components aren't hardened properly, that can cause them to fail. Power, of course, is a huge issue for us because our communications is electronics communications. Without power, it doesn't flow. And so having a disruption across the power infrastructure is going to have a large impact on the communications networks. Now, the communications networks does have some backup power at some places. The problem is it's not universal and it's not, there's not enough because as our technologies continue to expand, the telecommunications networks have continued to grow and grow and grow. And so they're always in the process of trying to play catch up to what's going forward. And so, you know, we don't have enough power and we don't have enough communications. So one of the other issues with communications networks is they're oversubscribed, banking on the fact that not everybody's going to be communicating them all at the same time. So that's why when we have a large event, we have a lot of disruption within, like, say, the cellular networks, because it cannot simply handle the excess capacity, the demand that's placed upon it, because it wasn't designed to do that. We just don't have enough of it. And I want to talk a little bit on what Matt had mentioned about, you know, he talked about an individual organization or an organization, like if we have a cyber attack and everything goes down, when you flip the switch, it's not going to immediately come back, right? It's going to come back in pieces and it's going to be degraded for a while coming back. One of those concepts, and there's a concept called convergence when you're dealing with networks. If I take an entire network down, the whole network becomes unstable for a very long period of time as it trades what's called routing tables back and forth between the routers, and they all try to learn all the routes back again, etc. And so that becomes a huge issue where networks might not be available for quite a long period of time when the power first comes back up as they converge. Now, when we amplify that across the black sky, and we have all these networks all trying to converge, all trying to come back online at the same time, I mean, even when the power comes back, we could be having major disruptions for long periods of time. Well, one of the other things to look at when we're looking at the communications network as a whole is, you know, we talk about the power grid, we talk about it being the largest, most complex machine that humankind has ever built. And the second one is probably that rivals it is the internet. I mean, it is probably the second largest, most complex machine that we've ever built. And we don't really fully understand it, right? I mean, it's so big and it's grown so organically and there's so many connections coming in from so many different places. It's impossible to map all of it and keep track of all of it. And that's why we get things like a fiber cut in one state takes out 911 in 4 other states that have nothing to do with it. And like, well, how did we get there? Because we can't simply map all that stuff out. We can't simply understand all of that. It's just too big. And so just like with a black sky, disrupting the power grid, and what's it take to black start that grid, and what's it going to look like? Well, what's it take to black start the telecommunications networks? Well, we don't really know, right? We haven't been there because it's just been growing organically, just as the power grid grew organically, so did our network. And so I think that's why it's key that organizations, need to focus on looking at what they can do to ensure that their critical communications are working. And I'll just throw one of the things out that the council's been working out with the power grid, which is our energy sector web, where we're looking at leveraging some of the dark fiber assets that the power companies have to actually build a resilient communications network with some EMP protection there. So at least we can get some base level communications. I'll stop there.
All right, thank you, Scott. And then let me throw a question as to what the communications industry needs information-wise from the electric sector when we have a very bad day like this.
Well, again, a couple of things that we need from the power industry. One obviously becomes the priority of restoration, right? Where are we at within priority of restoration? It comes back to the full cycle that we talked about at the hospital. And I'll give you a real world example. During the Maria hurricane down in Puerto Rico with some guys that were boots on the ground during the restoration. The political thing at the time was to focus on getting the hospitals up and running. But they still ended up having to evacuate the hospital, to your point, lack of water. It pulled all the resources, and therefore the resources weren't focused on the communications networks. But had the resources been focused on the communications network first, it would have amped up the ability for people to actually come together and coordinate those things and coordinate the logistics, right? Because in an emergency, it's all about logistics. It's all about how do I get stuff where it needs to get to the right people. And a lot of that requires coordination. Coordination requires communications. So, where is the communications at in a restoration effort? But now working with the power industry, I get the same exact thing from the power industry. They want to know, well, where are we at in the restoration efforts of the communications sector? So the two of them are both pointing at each other saying, hey, I need to be at the top of the list, right? So to your point, how do we prioritize those lists? So, I mean, that is one of the critical things that we would need is from an information thing is where are we at? How long do we expect until we get the power up? That way communications can do the planning that they need in order to, then we're back to relying on the transportation networks, right? How do we get the fuel there, right? This is, if I know I'm going to be out for X amount of time and I can't rely on the power coming back up, then I know I have to get generation. And if I know I don't have enough fuel, now I have to work to get the fuel to support me long enough for the power to come up. But if I know the power is going to come up in 12 hours, I don't need to worry about as much effort on getting the fuel in order to get my generators up, to get my communications networks up. So, I mean, that's a lot of the information that we're looking at.
Okay, thank you. What I hear is a lot of expectations, a lot of what I'm going to call, we operate under assumptions, and which is one of the reasons why we exercise is to test those assumptions. And having heard those now, Rick and Tom, I'd like for you to give the electric sector's perspective back to the others here about this scenario and the comments that they've had. Where are our strengths and weaknesses? Who wants to go first?
I'd be pleased to just jump in here. The first is, as I think everyone has already indicated, we really, at the end of the day, have to look at the electric sector probably as the first amongst equals of these subsectors. But the reality is they are all so highly integrated that we need to look at them together and look at these cascading issues and concerns. And from the electric sector perspective for an event like this, and several people, including Scott, just touched on it, it's really the sort of same analysis. First and foremost, what's the extent of the damage? What critical components of the electric infrastructure have been damaged to what extent? That will help inform the second, which is some level of prioritization of the restart, if that can be done, or the extent to which, from a time perspective, that those critical components will be out. That is really the first step that has to be taken for the system, for the electric system, and it will help inform then the ability to restore for these other critical subsectors. But that's the first step, really, is to determine the extent of the damage, what would be necessary to either repair or, if necessary, to restart. And that's the second big piece, is, as others have suggested, we've never really had the need or the circumstance to, at any level, in a significant way, to really do a restart of this grid. So there would have to be a whole team of people that really would have to just turn focus to that as those components need to be restarted. The other is, in the scenario that you present, is that it is regional, it is not national. And one of the other things that would have to be going on is a sharing of information in all of these subsectors, which will require the federal government and states to share information on the extent of the threat, and hopefully it could avoid and mitigate other areas of the country or North America, which the grid's all sort of interconnected, from having to face the same outages elsewhere. So hopefully, you could do a couple things: evaluate for the extent of the damage, evaluate what a restart would look like in this region, and nevertheless share and hopefully forestall any further intrusions or attacks elsewhere in North America.
All right, thank you, Rick. Tom.
Hey, thanks, Rick. And if you were in the room here with me, I'd give you a high five, because I have a very insular opinion in terms of which infrastructure is the most important. I tend to think of the electrical as if you'll forgive the glib metaphor, the proverbial long pole in the tent in recovery. And good incident management, good incident response is simplification. So simplifying the incident as much as possible. And if we're able to get the power back on, okay, we're able to stabilize communications. We're able to prevent hospitals from being evacuated, possibly. We're able to get water service going where it's not gravity fed. So, simplification, whether it's in math or incident response, if we're able to take some of the mass care and shelter problems, some of the care and feeding of the population problems off of government, whether it's county government, state government, federal government, if we're able to simplify those things, or simplify the equation in an incident response, we've just done a great service. Some of the things that will constrain us in doing that is that, while we have at Southern California Edison, and we're not terminally unique, we know other electric utilities are required to have some level of prioritization for customers: healthcare, water, wastewater, the lifelines. But that's sort of a blue sky emergency prioritization. And like what we saw in COVID was a different standard of care in healthcare, where it would have been unthinkable to have patients lying on the floor. But we saw that, right? In New York, we saw it here in LA, sort of an emergency prioritization. Hey, if we only have a certain amount of electricity, where would you have us send it? How would you have us prioritize it? And that's something that, we've done a little bit of that ad hoc in some of the incidents that we've had out here, where we've worked with counties to develop, for example, a multi-day power outage plan, where we've asked them prioritize the locations where you need generators or electricity. And they came back initially with a list of over 1,000 sites. And we said, what did you not understand about prioritize? You know, we're thinking 100 sites, not 500. Or anyhow, if you think of the principles of business continuity and a business impact analysis, and you apply that to a community or a county or a city, and you think about really what are of all the hospitals and skilled nursing facilities, skilled care facilities, what are the ones that you really have to have? Same thing for communications. I don't need to know the super secret function of the building at 1313 Mockingbird Lane. I just need to know you need power at 1313 Mockingbird Lane, and it's important. It is a challenge for us to work together. I don't want to filibuster here. I'm going to stop in a minute. But it is a challenge for us to work with all the infrastructures ahead of time, because there is no framework for integrated planning out there. There is no one entity that sort of forces or provides a framework or requires the infrastructures to work together. There are some grassroots efforts we're engaging in out in California that are just beginning to take shape. But yeah, it's a real struggle.
All right, thank you, Tom. There was something that I heard in here was a mention of Puerto Rico, and I'm going to say that is probably as close as we've come to a black sky scenario and restoration. I know, Tom, you had people that were in Puerto Rico as part of the restoration and recovery. And what lessons can we pull from that would apply in either a regional or much larger scenario like this?
You know, one of the lessons to take away, Ranger, is that, you know, these are things that the infrastructures can figure out amongst themselves as to what the order of priority may need to be. And taking that order of priority to government, or having some kind of multi-agency coordination capability among the infrastructures to take that to government, because government can't figure this out on its own, in my opinion, because they don't own most of the infrastructure. So figuring this out, having the subject matter experts from across the different domains, figuring this out ahead of time to an extent, so that there is an infrastructure recovery plan, maybe something that would provide a path forward.
All right, thanks. Rick, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, Tom's exactly right. I mean, in large scale incidents, we saw it here in New Jersey with and the Northeast with Superstorm Sandy, the need to coordinate between all agencies, all government organizations, federal and state, as well as the industry. You know, there's one other piece of this, though, that is really important for people to be considering and thinking about, because it can fall apart pretty quickly. That is the human aspect, meaning the workforce aspect. In a dramatic event like this, people are going to be the employees of this critical infrastructure. They're going to be concerned about their own families. They're going to be dealing with their own issues. There needs to be the pre-planning, the consideration of whether you can have sufficient workforce in place to be managing and doing that response, because they may not be where you think you need them in an event like this. So that consideration is really critical as well. The consideration in advance, pre-planning of the critical personnel that will do this response and recovery.
All right, thank you. And I think, Chris, you had a hand up a moment ago.
Well, yeah, I think most of what I wanted to comment on sort of came out naturally from Rick's response. But I just wanted to commend Thomas and Southern California Edison for this kind of pre-planning. It's kind of thing that EIS Council preaches about, to say, you know, we have to get our arms around this. We have to think about prioritization and so on. And I would say, Thomas, you're probably also right that government can't just do this because they don't have the expertise. But what government can do is understand that this is important and support the critical infrastructures and be a convener to say we all need a plan and we all need to know what we're going to do and who we need to talk to and how each of us can be supported. So you kind of naturally led into the cross-sector discussion that Ranger's going to lead in a second. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks. And then Tom, I'm going to go to you, and then we're going to go to the cross-sector discussion here.
Yeah, sorry, just a couple of quick things to mention. So, it was great hearing Eric's comments and all the other panelists' comments. Holy cow, emergency generators. There are not enough in the continental United States to deal with the challenges of this magnitude and even much smaller magnitudes. The federal government doesn't have them. The state government generally does not have access to generators. It is going to be a real struggle with the private sector in trying to deal with that. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Tom. And I realize that nobody wants to volunteer to do a system black start. I've watched some exercises of the hypotheticals, and I understand it would be very difficult. I think there's going to be a non-voluntary effort one of these days, probably with one of the West Coast utilities after we have our 8.0 earthquake. That will be a true test of the system, and the lessons learned will be wonderful for everybody else. So another potential out there. We have a lot of potential we've talked about, and what I want to do now is I'm going to step back and allow the panels to interact and ask questions of each other or provide answers.
Ranger, just want to jump in for a second and echo something Thomas just said in terms of the shortage of generators. So, and somebody mentioned, I think Richard mentioned Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico. So that was the first time the federal government's generator fleet actually ran short of the needs. So the federal government maintains the largest generator fleet in the United States, and it consists of FEMA-owned generators, but it's augmented by rental generators that FEMA contracts with from all of the big rental providers. So FEMA had plenty of large generators, 1 megawatt generators for Hurricane Maria recovery. But what they didn't have enough of was the smaller mid-sized generators. So a lot of requests from smaller healthcare clinics in Puerto Rico, small grocery stores went unanswered because FEMA did run out. So Thomas is 100% correct. I've had the pleasure of working with FEMA and U.S. Army Corps of Engineer officials over the years who are responsible for the federal generator fleet. And we've talked about that very question Thomas raised of how will we handle a situation in a black sky event when we run short of generators? And the answer I got back was that the feds have not yet exercised that scenario. And frankly, I think it's because they just don't want to, because they realize how incredibly difficult that will be in terms of decisions about who's going to get limited resources. And the final point I just want to make too, in terms of the fuel shortages, every governor, as I understand it, has the authority to declare a fuel emergency. And in a black sky event, that is a likely occurrence in all of the impacted states. And as I understand it, the authority to governors in that situation is to essentially commandeer all public and private fuel and make those decisions about who is going to receive those critical assets. So I love this conversation. We need to have more of them, and thanks to the panelists for teeing up such great points here.
All right, thank you, Eric. Let's go to Scott, and then Lisa, and then Matt.
Yeah, I just want to talk a couple moments about the generators, because there's a couple of other issues that we have to look at. We think a generator is going to solve all of our problems. We just talked about fuel. We could have a fuel emergency. The governors could take and declare all the fuel. Real world experience, when I went and responded to Katrina, the problem was the fuel was in the ground, but without electricity, there was no way to pump it out of the ground. So it didn't do any good. Then you have to look at the future, right? We're talking about looking at the future. As we move more and more to electric vehicles, there's our fuel source, right? So if the power grid's down, so is our fuel source. So that becomes an issue. When you get a generator, you have to have the generator hookups. I mean, I can say, here's a generator for a building. Do I have the way to connect that into the building? That becomes another issue. And if not, then I'm running a whole bunch of extension cords, and that becomes another whole big issue with all the safety factors and everything that's involved with running extension cords all over the place. I have some real work experience with that too, because the military doesn't plan that well, and like all my communications require generators, but then we have all kinds of extension cords running out in the field, running in with a bunch of water when it rains on top of it, and people walking around on top of that, which is just asking for someone to get electrocuted, which isn't a good thing. And then, you know, even if I have the generators, can I get them to the source? Real world experience, ice storm 2009 in Kentucky, the cellular networks were down. We asked the cellular networks, what's it take to get you up? They said, well, we've got the generators. We just can't get to the cell sites because of all the trees that have fallen down because of the ice storm. So that's where we shifted over and as a National Guard and tapped the National Guard resources to then go clear the paths with chainsaws to cut the trees out of the way so that we could get the generators up to the sites where the cellular networks were in order to bring the cellular networks back up. So, you know, there's a lot more pieces that you have to look at in addition to just, you know, like, hey, I need a generator. Okay, here's a generator, solves the problem. Have you thought through all these other pieces of that?
All right, thanks, Scott. Lisa.
Sure, I think this is all a really great discussion, but the reality is the generator is not your contingency solution. Like, bottom line, I think we talk a lot about generators and they're a great resource, but they should only be one tool in your whole toolkit. I know that I speak for healthcare, but when we look at the infrastructure and the makeup of the basic technology that allows all industries to operate day to day, the reliance on power for that is extreme. And I think that there is a huge disconnect from where we were, again, going back 10 years ago to where we are today. I mean, I tell all of my nurses on their unit, their phone that they use every day is not a phone anymore. It is a computer with a receiver on it that they're able to make calls with. Those voice over IP phones are reliant on power. Additionally, all of the connections that we have to run your day-to-day applications, whether that's Word or Outlook or Teams, any Microsoft applications, they're not housed on your computer anymore a lot of times. They're housed in a data center that leverages Citrix to receive that image. And all of that is reliant on power. And so I think we can continue to look at generator power. We can continue to identify what are other power sources. But going back to our intro, that's planning for disasters from the past. And what we need to be doing is understanding that this is a realistic thing. And if it's widespread, there won't be resources to go around and there won't be help. So what is your contingency plan to go back to paper? What is your contingency plan to bring people back on site? Where are you going to reallocate staff? Because you will need a bunch of runners depending on what industry you're in. So I think we really need to shift the way that we're thinking. And while generators are great, they are one minimal resource in the toolkit. And we really need to talk and look at, you know, whether it's a BIA or a criticality assessment to identify what are those downtime procedures, because I can guarantee in a situation like this on healthcare, we wouldn't even be able to utilize our electronic medical record and everything would be back on paper charting without the ability to do phone calls or leverage our tube system throughout the facility. We wouldn't be able to send images to other hospitals, which would have care issues. Our radios work off of power. So I think we really need to kind of put the generators aside and really look forward and what are those contingency plans to operate without this technology for an extended period of time.
Thank you. Let's go to Matt and then Rick and then Tom.
I love seeing all the thumbs up and the claps and everything. Lisa represents, rural, but if you look at really where our pivotal points are, our most vulnerable points, it's rural. So if there's a lesson to be learned here, let's not only rely on, what is the metro response going to be? If we can take rural as the example, they really know how to get things done. I just want to echo one point from earlier, and that is around exercising. Usually it's difficult to get a good, effective tabletop exercise within your organization, let alone when you try and involve cross-sector. So if there was an ask that I think all of us have the ability to influence today. It's to network, it's to connect with those who provide critical infrastructure to each of our industries and to our businesses alike, and to start having actual tabletops that are pertinent to the threats of tomorrow. So again, to echo what Lisa said, we need to not plan for yesterday's events. When we talk about ransomware, you're down weeks, if not months. And you don't have that luxury of just saying, we'll go to downtime procedures for a few hours, then we're back to business.
All right, thank you, Matt. And a shameless plug here. We do have a number of exercises based on our Black Sky events that we have on our website. They're free to use, multi-sector if you want. Feel free. That's a plug for Leahy for the website. Next, I think we're going to Rick and then Tom, and then I see Lisa's hand up after that.
Yeah, thanks. And I want to just make an observation and call out Lisa's comments, because she is essentially sort of highlighting what is the fundamentals of this conversation. That is that all enterprises, whether they're a hospital, whether they're a communications center, whether they're a financial organization, or whether it's an electric company, needs to be doing very basic business continuity planning. That's what Lisa really just called out, is, if you anticipate your business will be interrupted without power for an extended period of time, how are you going to operate? That's the fundamental question that everyone should be asking of their own enterprise, of their own workforce, to plan for these extended kind of or widespread outages of this interconnected world. So I think it's a fundamental question that everyone should be asking is, what's their business continuity plan? And that is a very basic question that everybody should be working towards.
All right, Tom.
Thanks. And to double down on what Rick and Lisa both said is, the expectations in terms of continuity planning have changed a little bit. Maybe I'm slow in waking up to that fact, like in the last year, where it's not just, our continuity planning factors here, for example, or design assumptions. Hey, loss of technology, loss of personnel, loss of facility, and maybe a few other things. But, the days of, hey, if you had an electronic system that you were dependent on and you had geographic separation between the primary and the backup and real-time mirroring, you were really living. That was really high availability. That was a Cadillac of resiliency. But now, okay, we're having to plan for people deliberately taking, insidiously getting in and taking your systems offline, where, your planning factor might have to be, hey, I've got to live without this system for a month. So to Lisa's point, how do I deal with this? I'm not going to have it back in 2 weeks. I'm not going to have it back in 3 weeks. I may have to black start without an energy management system. How do you do that? We know it took San Diego 12 to 16 hours, maybe a little bit longer, in 2011, when they had a sort of a blackout in their portion of the grid back years ago. Well, when they were recovering, they had a fully functioning energy management system. So, yeah, basically, from a leadership standpoint, conveying that, hey, the expectations have changed. The planning factor and design assumptions, which your plan has to be designed to, the challenges your plan has to be designed to overcome, have changed materially. And anyway, so that was sort of a learning over the last year or two, which was a big one on our end. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Tom. Matt, I see your hand up, and then we're going to take a few of the audience questions before we move on to the next phase.
Just a quick comment. I really appreciated and resonated with what Tom just said around resiliency. Another recent change that has happened that has impacted almost everyone on this call was the impact of Change Healthcare, which is owned by United Healthcare. Even companies, healthcare companies, didn't realize their dependency on Change Health. They may not have even had Change Health as a vendor, yet saw that downstream impact directly to their customers, which in our case is a patient, not a typical retail customer. And so if there's another takeaway we could do, it's don't only look at your third parties, look at your third parties, and knowing those interdependencies, and then building resilience plans to say, if this third party goes out that's critical to our operations, do we have another one on retainer? Or do we have some other way to go around this? Because I'll tell you, healthcare scrambled. When February 21st hit and it became a reality that a third of healthcare depended on one specific vendor, I think everything changed in cyber, and I think hopefully has changed things in business resilience. I'll drop a link to an excellent article in HBR that our CISO, Eric Decker, penned that really talks about these nodes and how they're interconnected, again, relevant to every industry.
All right, thank you, Matt. And it goes back to those assumptions. Everybody has their planning assumptions, their what they believe their continuity is going to be. And I've heard a number of organizations say, yes, we're going to receive all of our supplies from Walmart in a disaster. They're going to supply all of the water. The next city says it, the next city says it, and pretty soon the assumption is a false assumption. So I challenge everybody in your exercises and in your planning, check those assumptions and make sure they're really valid. What I'm going to do now is throw a couple of questions out there that came in from the audience. There's one from Anthony, and the question is, how far are we from one of these big blackout events? Days, months, years, minutes? Okay.
I guess I'll take a stab at that. I think the reality is we don't know. I think we continue to see the cybersecurity environment continue to become more robust, and the reality really is we could be minutes away. I think over the last 5 years, we've seen things that might have been created or seen as unethical become completely commonplace for these bad actors. And it's become a really complex business, really. So I think it makes me almost want to be sick as a cyber professional to say that there's a potential here very soon. But the reality is this scenario isn't, well, it makes me very sick. It is not far-fetched by any means.
I understand it's the one we don't want to think about, but we have the potentials become more out there. Scott and then Tom, please.
Yeah, well, according to all those science experts that look at this stuff, we're only 90 seconds away. The doomsday clock has just moved to 90 seconds, and we're closest to midnight than we've ever been in history. So 90 seconds.
All right, thank you, Tom.
So hopefully we're not 90 seconds away from a nuclear detonation. But I think about it, Ranger, we're mouse clicks away from, massive ransomware issues. With all the time and treasure we spend on these Maginot Lines and defense in depth, it's the lowest common denominator in the company clicking on a phishing or a spear phishing attack, which, they're getting better and better and harder to recognize. So it's scary.
Understand that. Paul,
I was going to say the 90 seconds, though, isn't just dealing with nuclear. It's dealing with all kinds of the new factor in everything. So it's not just nuclear, but that's how close we are to catch.
All right, thank you. Paul.
I was just going to add, I put a comment in the Q&A, actually. The recent geomagnetic storms that we've seen over this last week were classified as G4 on a scale of G5. G5 is the worst there is and could result in grid collapse and electrical failure. And what seems to be characteristic about those events is remarkably poor forward planning on them. So it's impossible to answer the question, but it could be surprisingly soon. The largest geomagnetic storm we've had was the Carrington event, and that was well over 100 years ago. So on the laws of probability, we're well overdue a significant event. And if that's not bad enough, in the context of this conversation and cyber, it's worth remembering that the UK's National Health Service was crippled by a cyber attack, I think 2018. It was crippled by WannaCry. It wasn't a target. It wasn't intended to be crippled. It was accidentally crippled because of the indiscriminate use of very powerful cyber weapons. So actually, the possibility of something happening is at least as good as it happening by accident as it is happening by design, particularly as we operate in such a complex machine where things can break in unexpected places and transmit in unpredictable ways.
All right, thank you, Paul. We'll go to Matt, and then we're gonna from there go to the video for the next segment.
I just want to echo that every sector has the opportunity to do basic protections. If you look at how ransomware enters environment, it used to be very sophisticated nation states with huge amounts of resources. Now you can have ransomware as a service for as low as $100. It does not take the armies that it once did to be able to cripple a system. Basic controls like two-factor authentication, like not exposing critical infrastructure to the World Wide Web. Those are two failures that we saw in this change incident. Two opportunities, I would say, the rest of us have to be able to reassess our organization so that we don't fall victim. We don't live long enough to make all the mistakes. We need to start learning from others.
All right, thank you, Matt. And one parting thing before we go to the next phase with the video is a lot of our assumptions are based on 72 hours, 96 hours. Keep that in mind as we look at the video that Lee's about to play and show us how our scenario progresses. Lee, please.
This thing is beginning to look more serious than just a conventional ransomware attack. Intermittent power outages across most of the regions of the US, Europe, Asia. There have been sporadic outages at communications networks, cell phone service, spotty in many areas.
To give you a sense of how this event is affecting major cities, this natural gas drying plant's control systems were attacked, causing the facility to cease operations. That caused a number of power grid regions to go down, including a chemical plant here, whose backup generator failed to operate a chemical refrigeration unit, causing a minor explosion and a fire to break out.
We are seeing heavy disruptions to standard communications at this point. Information available to the public is becoming more and more limited. A number of major internet cloud providers have been attacked, causing retrieval disruptions, site slowdowns, and data loss for many users. And we are now seeing attacks around the world on nearly all critical lifeline networks. In some countries, the developing financial crisis is more serious than in others. Here is a UK news broadcast.
Because most banks, financial services, and insurance companies are closed, many companies can't pay employees and commodity distribution has slowed substantially. The government is planning to meet with EU and Asian finance ministries and banks to explore options for emergency financial mechanisms. It's a mostly cash economy in the UK at this point, and with banks closed, people's supplies of cash are dwindling.
All right, thank you, Lee. So, panelists, we've increased the impacts. We've taken it not just regionally, but worldwide. What do you think are your concerns at this point with that 72 and 96 hour preparation levels?
I'll jump in real quick. 72 has been too low of a bar for far too long. Just like 30 days backup for companies typically tends to be the standard. 30 days is far too low of backups. There's many cases where ransomware and bad actors have been in environments far longer than that 30-day threshold. So you can't trust and rely upon that data. So I would echo that we need to raise that bar, and that standard should be set much higher.
Yeah, again, Ranger, the changing of the expectation and what the planning factors need to be needs to change. So the design assumptions of the plans that are out there, I think need to change. And just like Lisa said, where, hey, yeah, we can't be dependent on a generator or power coming back soon. We need to figure out, how do we do this manually again? And that's a question we've wrestled with and are playing with here at SCE of, hey, how do we operate our electric system old school? How do we go to manual operations? And it's not, I will tell you, it's not easy or simple, because all the people that did that, they're long gone. And all the lessons learned, and are we staffed to do that for any length of time? It's going to be a challenge, but it's something that we're actively working on, even as I sit here today.
And I'll jump in, Ranger. I'll jump in here
Go
and
ahead,
echo
Rick.
that. Yeah, and I'll echo that on even prior EarthX conversations that EIS has held. We've talked about this issue, which is that in the power industry, the desire to have what's being referred to as a spare tire approach to the technology so that they can be operated manually. But this does come back to the conversation we've already had about looking at that business continuity. How can you run if you're without power, or you no longer have what is becoming an increasingly digitized set of subsectors? How do you operate? And as Lisa mentioned, maybe you have to go back to paper. Maybe you have to have literally those manual systems to keep your operation running. It's the kind of planning that every enterprise really ought to think about. Even though it's unthinkable, they should think about it and they should plan for it.
All right,
have
thank
here
you.
That, sorry.
I was going to say, yeah, I was going to say, on the communications side of it, you can already tell just the impacts that that scenario would have, because through doing these black sky exercises, EIS Council has done a lot of these black sky exercises with organizations and EarthX and stuff over the years. And the one thing that they found through exercise after exercise is it doesn't go anywhere without communications. And if you notice in there, when we use the BSX communications, this is our concept of like how we could communicate in a black sky, because none of this would even get to that point if we didn't have something to operate off of. And you know, Richard brought up the spare tire. You know, the spare tire, when the electrical sector studied this problem through GridX, that was one of their biggest issues, is how are we going to communicate? Because none of this will get put back together without communications. So, I mean, I think when you ask, how does that scenario affect us at 72 or 30 or 96 hours out? It's pretty obvious how it's going to affect the communications sector. It's just not prepared to support that. And we've got to come up with contingencies, because without it, this stuff becomes so much harder, if not impossible, to put that together.
Thanks, Scott. And I wonder how renewables will also play into this all the way around, EVs, a lot of different new technologies. Tom, we'll be able to take a couple more, and then we're going to have some closing comments.
Thanks, Ranger. And, you know, Rick mentioned the spare tire. And the thing to remember about the spare tire is, you know, we look at the little donut spares. If you've had a flat tire recently in the back of your in your trunk, if you can manage to find it, and you can't go 60 miles an hour on a spare tire. You are operating at reduced speed, and that spare tire is to get you to the point where you can make repairs. So anyways, it's something that we're looking at, and you know, we actually do have a spare tire here at SCE, but really looking at increasing the capability in that space, because in operating in integrated mode, we're not going to have the same level of reliability or resiliency in the system. So outages that do occur when you're operating in that degraded mode are going to be more complex or may take longer to restore. Thanks.
All right, thank you, Tom. And I want to thank all of the panelists for bringing all the different perspectives here. I think this is how we start conversations, not just talking amongst ourselves, but reaching out to folks from those other organizations that we depend on or don't even know that we depend on. I want to thank the audience here for the questions, the comments. The chat has been very robust. What I'd like to do is turn it over to our leadership now of Paul and Avi for some closing comments.
Let me just jump in for a minute then. Hey, Ranger, outstanding job. And to all the panelists, thank you so much for being here and for your very insightful, forward-looking points. And I'm excited about this exercise because everyone involved really was focusing on not the past, but the future. We don't know what's coming. We don't know when it's coming. And the only opportunity we have to prepare is now. And I would just leave you with this thought. If this is a concern to you, and I imagine for just about everybody participating and listening, it is, please don't just take this as an interesting exercise. Think about this on a personal level, because what it takes is individual action by each of us, either in the organization you work for or you support, or just as something that can be thought about and planned for in your family, maybe talking to your friends and community leaders. If we can begin building the willpower to address the planning that's actually needed now for these kinds of events, we can really change things.
All right, thank you, Avi. Paul, any closing comments?
I think Avi's summed it up really well. I guess my only observation will be the same observation I make at the end of these exercises whenever we do them in whatever context, which is there are some shocks which are so severe that unless you're prepared for them, you're not going to survive them. You can't muddle through them. And this has exemplified again that you need to do some preparation for such a scenario. Otherwise, you're not going to survive it. And in making that distinction, I would draw a distinction echoing on the previous points that resilience is not a proxy for risk management. Resilience is about protecting what you care most about and making sure you can sustain those critical things, not everything that you need on a day-to-day basis. And even identifying those can put you in a much better position when a shock comes, because you know where to focus the limited resources that you've got. Identifying them, though, can be remarkably difficult. So start the planning now. Otherwise, echo Avi's comments. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. It was a fantastic participation and a great panel. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Leahy.
Always, just an important reminder, get your spot in our next event in London. Today you just tasted the type of discussions that we're going to have there. So please reach out, and I want to thank you again for being such a good and supportive community. All the messages that you send and shares, and we're better together. This is the power of the group. So I wanted to thank all the experts and the audience for being so engaged. Thank you, and Ranger, of course. Thank you.
All right, thank you all.
See you next time.